Our application is just about feature complete, but there's one last major thing we need to add in. If I go to the page to create a snippet right now, I can create a snippet without actually adding in any title or any code. So if I just click on create, there we go, I got an empty snippet. And if I open that thing up, I see no content at all, no title, no code. Obviously, this isn't really desirable. So we need to add in some validation. We need to make sure that whenever a user tries to submit this form, we make sure that they add in some valid title and some code. And if they don't, I want to show an error message to the user. In addition, I want to make sure that we just have some general error handling. So if anything goes wrong with inserting this data into our database, I want to print out an error message for that as well. Now, this entire process would usually be very, very easy if we were making a normal React component. Adding a validation to a normal React component is really not the worst thing in the world. But right now, we are using server forms. These are forms that can run completely without any JavaScript in the user's browser. And that's kind of a huge point of what we're doing here. So whatever solution we come up with to add in this validation, it must work without JavaScript running in the user's browser. That's the key part. And that's why adding in this error handling and this the form validation is going to be a little bit challenging. Just keep that in mind, because as we go through this process, it's going to seem a little bit confusing. It's all because we're trying to do this stuff without running any JavaScript in the browser. Okay, so here's the general idea. Right now, whenever a user comes to our application, we send a form down to them from one of our page files. And then when a user submits that form, information is being taken from the form and sent to a server action. The server action then runs, and that's kind of that. We then redirect the user to some other page in our application. So what we really need to do here is reverse that communication. We need to somehow allow a server action to run, but allow that server action to somehow get our page to render again with an error message being displayed on it. So that's what we were really trying to do. We are really trying to communicate from a server action back to a page. To do so, we are going to use a very specially made hook from the React DOM library. Notice that it is React DOM, not React. This hook is called UseFormState. Because this is a hook, we cannot use it with a server component, so it can only be used with a client component. Now you might think that using a client component, but also saying that we want to run JavaScript or no JavaScript in the browser is an issue. Remember, something I've mentioned a couple times now, and I've said, hey, later on this is going to be really important. Client components are actually rendered on the server. They just have the ability to also run some JavaScript code in the browser. So even though we are going to use this hook with a client component, it is still going to work just fine, even if the user is not running JavaScript in the browser. Okay, so let's figure out how that hook works. First, we're going to review how our forms generally work when we are not using this hook at all. So we might have some page component. It's going to run, it's going to generate some HTML. It's going to create a form. We display that to the user. The user enters in some title and code, and they click on that save button. Then the browser is going to automatically collect all the info out of that form and send it off to our backend server, where it gets turned into some form data object and then fed into our server action. And the whole issue right now with this entire process is that if the server action runs and realizes that there is an issue with the form data, it doesn't have any way to somehow say that it wants us to re-render the page component and display an error message. We just don't really have that ability right now without doing some really hacky stuff. So that's where the UseFormState hook is going to come into play. Here's how it works. So we're going to use UseFormState now. Inside of our page component, we're going to make use of that hook. Because we're using a hook, this thing must now be a client component. Inside of the component, when we call UseFormState, we're going to pass in some initial object referred to as our form state. Right now, this is going to be a very simple object that has nothing but a message property that is a string. Then, whenever we render our form, this form state object is going to kind of magically embed itself inside of the form's HTML. So we can imagine this object kind of gets directly sent down to the user's browser, and it's going to be included in this form invisibly behind the scenes. Then a user, as usual, is going to enter in a title, some code, and click on save. When they submit the form, just as before, the browser is going to collect that information. It'll be sent off to our backend server, where it gets assembled into some form data object. But along with that form data, this form state object is also going to be included. So now when our server action gets called, it's going to receive two arguments. It's going to receive the form state and the form data. Then inside the server action, we can run some validation code and make sure that the user put in some kind of valid title and code property. And if the server action thinks that there is some issue with that data, or if really anything goes wrong at all, the server action now has the ability to communicate that back into our page component. Here's how it does it, and this is the most important part of this entire video, so please pay attention to this next step. In order for the server action to communicate back over to the page component, all it has to do is take that form state object, change something on it, like maybe add in some message property right here that says title must be longer, and return it. That's it. That's all it has to do. So if we want to communicate from the server action back over here to our page component, server action just has to return something. Whatever it returns is going to be sent back over to our page component. The page component is going to re-render. And when it re-renders, it's going to have access to this new form state object, which now includes this nice little message property. Then when it renders, it can take that message property and print it out on the string or on the screen and say something like title must be longer. And that's it. That's the entire process. Now, if that sounds kind of complex and involved, please just remember it is like this because we are trying to build forms specifically that work without JavaScript. So this is kind of as elegant as we can make it, so to speak. So this is just how it works if we want to be able to build forms that run without JavaScript. All right, so that's kind of the entire process. So let's now go ahead and start implementing it inside of our project.